Now then, one of the issues that also looks set to dominate the next year's politics is the promised referendum, of course, on Britain's membership of the European Union. In an interview this morning, Mr Cameron says he will rule nothing out if he doesn't get his way in renegotiations with the EU. Well, Labour has promised to campaign for the party to stay in Europe no matter which way the Prime Minister's discussions go. I'm joined now by the Shadow Europe Minister, Pat McFadden, and very good morning to you, Mr McFadden. I know you sat there listening to that conversation I was having with Mr Lewis. I'd just be interested to get your take on Syria and the Labour Party position if faced with a vote in the House of Commons on extending British military activities from Iraq into Syria. We know there's a strong groundswell within the party to say no. Isn't that now bolstered by the further complications of Russian military action there?
Well, I think we need to look at the proposal if it comes. We took a vote about a year ago in the House of Commons to support airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq, but not in Syria. For my part, I've always wondered what the moral justification was of coming to the aid of the victims of ISIS in Iraq, but not in Syria. This is, after all, a border they don't recognise at all in the caliphate that they're trying to build. So I don't begin from the premise that extending the air campaign to Syria is impossible. But obviously, the actions that the Russians have taken in recent days have complicated matters there. I think we'd have to ask what exactly is it that further action by British forces would contribute to a situation like this, with the Russians and the Americans in different ways already engaged there. I don't have an in-principle objection to doing this, because I agree with Julian that ISIS represents a huge danger to us in terms of values and our way of life, that responding to that should not rule things out militarily, but I think we'd have to see exactly what the proposal was and what it was expected to add.
Well, thanks for that, Mr McFadden. Let's get on to the issue of Europe. And again, the Labour position. Let's try to work this out, try and bring some clarity to me, because the Prime Minister now saying that if he doesn't get what he wants in renegotiations, he rules nothing out. Now, one of the things he might want in renegotiations are dealing with employment rights and some of the red tape, as they describe it, surrounding those issues. But we've heard from Labour saying, well, if they go, some of us, or all of us, or the whole party, might actually campaign for out. Is that the case?
That's not the position, no. Some of our friends in the trade unions have quite rightly said...
Well, the GMB.
The GMB and others have quite rightly said Europe is an important source of social protection and rights for people at work. One thinks of the rights to paid leave, equal rights for part-time workers, anti-discrimination measures and so on. There's been quite a lot over the years. So what they've said is we don't want the Prime Minister to rip these things up as part of his renegotiation. Now, neither do I. I think that would be wrong and foolish.
So you want him to fail?
No, I don't want him to fail.
So you want him to fail and then you'd vote for in and he'd be voting for out? I mean, it's very complicated.
It's not really that complicated, because the question on the ballot paper is remain or leave. The word maybe is not on the ballot paper. If the Prime Minister was unwise enough to try and rip up everybody's employment rights as part of his renegotiation. And by the way, it's not clear at all that that's going to happen. I'm not, he certainly didn't mention that on any interviews today. But if he did that, the right response wouldn't be to leave the European Union, because then, by definition, people at work wouldn't have access to any EU-wide employment rights, because they'd be outside the European Union. The right response to that would be for us to campaign at a subsequent election to opt back into those measures. And we've done this before. When the social chapter, the original sort of EU-wide employment rights piece of all this, was put in place, the Conservative government at the time, under John Major, opted out of it. They said they didn't want to sign up to that. We disagreed with that in opposition. We said we would opt into that chapter if we got elected, and that's precisely what we did when we won power. And we couldn't have done that if we'd been outside the European Union. So for us, this position, we don't want to see the employment rights diminished, but the in-principle position in the referendum is very clear and was confirmed at our conference last week. We will campaign, and Alan Johnson's been appointed to lead the Labour campaign on this, for Britain to remain in the European Union when the referendum comes. OK, let me
just ask you this overall about the party and your leaders' actions tomorrow going up to join demonstrations and protests. I mean, there is a convention by and large, that has pertained in British politics, that you don't really queer the pitch as leader for somebody else's party conference. Mr Corbyn deciding to go to Manchester, join some of these protests. I mean, do you think that in itself is perhaps treading too much on their toes, and also rather underlines the difference between your parties? There is one party taking decisions that affect the very future of the country, international affairs, and Mr Corbyn's outside with a lot of people shouting impotently.
Well, for me, it's not about conventions. I mean, conventions are there, sometimes they're broken or not, but I think the second part of your question is what I'd like to address. Mr Corbyn is a person who, if you like, spent his background in protest movements, going to lots of demonstrations and so on. There is a culture of protest in the Labour Party. It's always been there, going back many decades, and it has its place. But government is different from protest. And what I want to see is a party that can get elected and can implement change. And everything that we've managed to achieve, be it from the creation of the NHS to the introduction of the minimum wage, has been based on being able to win elections. And there's a difference between being a party of protest and a party of government. And I think one of the important things for him is to make that transition as a politician, from one of protest to one, at least potentially, of government, because they're not the same thing. And what I don't want to see is the Labour Party's job description being changed from being either a party of government or at least contesting elections seriously to become a party of government, to being satisfied with just being a protest movement, because that would be a fundamental change in our job description and our relationship with the British people, and that's not something that I want to see.